Being late in the day has some advantages because I had the opportunity now to listen to all these different approaches. And sitting through the day reminded me of this ancient parable of the 7 blind men and the elephant, where 7 blind men stumble upon an elephant and they all touch different ends of the elephant. And the one who touches the legs thinks, the elephant is like a tree. It has a trunk, and the one that touches the end, the tail, says, the elephant is like a rope. And the one that touches the trunk says, the elephant is like a snake. So they all have a different vision of the elephant. And now my understanding that we have all a little bit a different understanding of blockchain and governance. So I thought maybe it's worth going back to some of the basics. The reason for that is that there are very different disciplines or approaches or cultures that try to think about a very complex thing. And what I see, there have been some references to the blockchain thought leaders, how they think about governance and how blockchain developers think about these issues. My impression is that this very technologically driven project that has been blockchain for the last decade suddenly realized that, for example, there are lawyers, or there are political scientists, or there are ethicists who are also thinking about the very same issues. And it takes lots of time to actually build those bridges between these very different disciplines that are not there yet. And being here at the TU Delft, it's easier to think about how economics, engineering, computer science, security, cryptography, ethics interact, because we are logged in the same campus, but this is not usually the thing. So I would like to think about a couple of very fundamental questions. What is governance? Who is governance? When is governance? Where is governance? How is governance? Coming from the legal perspective, of course, governance is control. And the question is how you control a technology. And it's very purely about this simple question. And it's a tricky question because I don't know if you want to guess what is on this picture.
Fanfare without instruments.
Sorry?
No fanfare without instruments.
It looks like they are military men, but they are actually the Polish railway workers, railwaymen. And I brought this picture because the railway was the first machine which was so huge that it was already more than one time zones, right? The railway is a machine and it's large. And the way to control this machine was to behave like it was a military operation. So the reason railwaymen have uniforms, the reason why telegraph men had uniforms and military hierarchies was the reason that it reflected the mode of control of that technology. Right? It was a very hierarchical, military-like organization. And this is how, so far, we have been controlling these complex machines in a very strict hierarchy. But now, we are in a decentralized mode of operation. And decentralization, in very technical terms, means that there are multiple authorities who control different components of a system, but no authority controls the whole. And no authority is trusted by everyone, right? So this is the fundamental lack of hierarchy. And the question is, under these conditions, how we control planetary scale technologies, right? And there is no answer for that, because this is a very brand new question. The first technology that we had to control this way is the internet, and there is no good internet governance, right? The internet governance is a mess. So we don't have answers to this question. So we don't have answer to this whole topic of the day, how to govern blockchain, because we haven't figured it out yet. But we have some clues, and some of the puzzle pieces have already been mentioned. This is Ostrom's work. Because there have been in history situations where there were no hierarchies, but people had to come to terms, had to agree on how to make sure that some kind of a common resource doesn't collapse, whether that's a fishery, or whether that's a wood, a forest, or whether that's an irrigation system. People, absent of state hierarchies, absent of the Leviathan, come to agreement on how they can actually make sure that their whole livelihood does not collapse. And this is the challenge here with the blockchain technologies as well, right? How do we make sure that if we rely on a complex technology, it doesn't collapse under our weight? And there have been, so far today, I've heard a number of proposals or a number of ideas of how to govern. But I haven't heard so far why we want to govern. What is the reason of governance? And these are really nicely spelled out by Elinor Ostrom. And when I see it's difficult to actually bridge different discourses, I wonder how many computer scientists, engineers, cryptographers, and mathematicians are actually have to read Ostrom, have to read economic history, have to read cultural anthropology. I'm not sure that this is an obligatory reading in CS courses. But when Ostrom did anthropological work among native marginal communities, she found that she stumbled upon a number of must-haves that I think computer scientists also have to solve. It's like, how do you define the ins and the outs? How do you say who is in? How do you set boundaries? Are there any boundaries? I can translate these questions with the current blockchain discourse. If there is an open and permission technology, can you define who is in and who is out? Can you set the boundaries? Right? And in computer science terms, this translates into how do I prevent Sybil attacks and so on. But how do you define who is the stakeholder? Who I should ask about? How do I define tasks? How do I define rights? How do I define responsibilities? Because without such boundaries, it's very difficult to design the next step, and that is how do we make rules? Right? Who is in when it comes to make rules? I'm going to be voting in the upcoming regional elections, but that is because I've taken all the steps as a Hungarian citizen to register myself here, which made me eligible to vote. And I do myself all the necessary requirements that I'm actually not just eligible legally to vote, but actually I understand the stakes at hand. But how are those decision-making procedures set? How do we define the rules, and how do we define the rule-making of the rules is the second question that we have to ask. And this is the task of governments. The third task is that we have to make sure that everything goes in order, right? The rules are working as expected. How do we monitor the operation of a system? How do we monitor those who tasked with certain tasks that they are doing their job? How do we identify risks? How do they recognize risks? How do we respond to things that go wrong? These are very simple questions that we can ask from a system. Do you know how you monitor that everything is going as intended? How do you monitor that there is no concentration of power? How do you monitor that there is no attack going on the system? How do you monitor that all the bugs are recognized? There is no system without conflict resolution. Again, this is a must. This is not something that's negotiable. And if there is no dispute resolution, then there is no governance, right? What is the applicable law? How you sanction misbehavior? How you make sure that the sanctions are appropriate? How you repair something? If you don't have answers to this question, then there is no, again, governance of a system. How you make sure that whatever the system is doing, it's interfacing with its environment, whether that's an ecological interface, whether that's a legal interface, whether that's an institutional interface. If there are no answers, like what is the applicable law, then there is no governance again. And finally, how you make sure, and that has been already mentioned, how do you make sure that whatever the system is actually in harmony with the environment that's being used or with the task it's being used? There is no one size fits all. Context matters, that has been said a number of times, and governance mechanisms, answers to these questions need to be context specific. So I would like to argue that governance is this: boundaries, membership, conflict resolution, sanctions, monitoring, rulemaking, right? And the question then is how we build such a system in a decentralized environment. And of course, we have a governance system that is like what the state is offering us. Like it's the legislator, it's the justice system, it's all the functions of the state. But the problem with the decentralized networks, many of the decentralized networks, is they want to be independent of the state machinery. That was this whole idea. So the question is, unless there is a complete governance stack built autonomously within the technology, can we speak about governance of the technology? I would say no. And we are not there yet. The technology is not there yet to offer everything, this whole stack, by itself. So there must be some hybrid governance where we rely some aspects on automation, some aspects being solved internally, and some aspects using the existing external frameworks of the justice system, of the courts, of existing regulations. We rely on them because they are there. But we understand that this is not a purely state-controlled affair, right? State is relying on others to make sure that the order is there, that there are policies and rules established and enforced. Again, where governance? I think when we speak about blockchain governance, it's very easy to conflate many different things. And usually, and this is what I've heard today as well, is that we think about, so at least what I see from the computer science discourse, that the governance is about how we govern the blockchain network, or how we govern the blockchain code. Because this is the main question for the developing community. But there are so many layers where this governance question can be asked, and there is no governance without having an answer to the previous questions in these layers, right? And some of them are governed by markets, some of them controlled by major corporations, some of them is the domain of national security, some of them is domain of internet governance, some of these questions are the domain of the nation state, but these are all interlocking levels of governance. And when we think about blockchain governance, it's not purely the infrastructure development, the software, the code, nor the infrastructure operation, the nodes and the network. And ultimately, why we need to think about governance? And I would say because if there is no governance, there is no transparent, reliable, tested institution structures of governance, either provided by the state or provided autonomously by the technology or in some kind of a hybrid, then we have nothing to speak about. There is nothing there if there is no governance, because a system without the governance is a non-functioning system. It will not work. I'm not saying that these systems will not develop all those functions that I labeled as governance: conflict resolution, rulemaking, sanctions, and so on. That can happen. It's not there yet, but I don't understand why would anyone want to use a system which is unable to enforce its own rules, which is unable to actually sanction bad behavior. It's unable to provide justice. Would you use a system where you are faulted and you cannot seek justice. So what I see is that, and I'm trying to narrow this focus down because it's so big, that there is a problem here, and that's the problem is that decentralization does not lend itself easily to clear governance structures. Because decentralization is all about avoiding control. This is why you decentralize, to avoid this hierarchy of control. And if you avoid that, then it becomes very difficult to provide some of these elements. They're very difficult to get redress, for example. So I think the Bitcoin network has a very particular answer to the question, if my money is stolen, can someone refund it to me? Is there someone I can ask redress? And the answer in the decentralized environment is that of course not. This is how we designed the system, so we cannot do that. We cannot reverse transactions, and that's okay, but that limits the usefulness.
But that's like
Yeah. So I think that there is a fundamental trade-off between the level of decentralization and the level of control or the controllability. So as we move towards this Bitcoin maximalist idea, so we lose the ability of governance depth or scope. So I see, at least what I see in this working group Adis is heading, a very clear choice to be made. And one is that leave the governance problems of open, unpermissioned configurations of the networks to themselves to solve, because their architecture is as such that it's impossible to influence or control it from the outside. It won't happen from the outside. It has to happen from the bottom up and from within. And let's see if it happens. And let's see what kind of governance functions are being built there. So what I think we as a group, whether that's ISO or whether that's the Dutch Blockchain Coalition or whether that's researchers, cannot do is to solve the governance problem of open unpermissioned configurations of this technology. We cannot expect to be heard and followed within that narrow community because they are following their own agenda. And we cannot actually enable private and public parties to interface or use such technologies, simply because there is no governance in sufficient depth there. But I think that there is a number of things that we can do. And that is, for example, provide very clear expectations of what kind of functions we expect from a technology to fulfill when it comes to governance. We can ask these questions from a technology. We can ask this question from a project. We can ask this question from an implementation. Do you have conflict resolution? Do you have sanctions regime? Do you have monitoring regimes? And we can ask, what are your answers to these questions? We can actually compare and assess these different questions. And we can say, this answer, I understand, it provides very minimal protections for the users. I understand that this is the design. This is a much more legally compliant. It gives you legal protections. That's a different answer. And we can actually then sort different implementations according to how deep their governance structures are. We can also think about what are the minimum standards of engagement for public and private institutions in terms of governance. When can a ministry say, this is the list that all the blockchain projects that want to interface with me have to fulfill, so I can actually work with them? ING can actually ask, what are those minimum levels of governance, minimum viable governance, as it was said before I can engage with any external project. And finally, we can actually think about how we interface between existing institutions and processes of governance, both from the private sector and from the state and from these technological systems. Thank you.
Okay.